I have known August Holt for 41 years, and I will tell you plainly that I never expected to see him proved wrong by a woman with a dead horse and a flour sack for luggage. But that is how it began. And since you asked, since you are his daughter and you have a right to know how your mother came to be standing in that yard, I will tell it to you the way I saw it, from the beginning, without dressing it up. It was the 3rd of November, 1887. The basin had gone cold early that year, the way it sometimes does when the mountains have been holding weather all October and finally let go. The grass along the creek was already brown and flat, and there was a smell in the air every morning that told you snow was not far off. I had been at the Holt Ranch since your grandfather's time, and I knew that smell the way I knew my own hand. I was coming back from the north pasture with 2 of the younger hands, Dobie Fitch and a boy called Red, whose real name I never once heard used, when we saw the horse. It was down at the gate, not down the way a horse goes when it trips, down the way one goes when it has been pushed past its limit and simply run out of whatever was holding it up. A gray mare, travel-worn to the bone, lying on her side in the frozen ruts of the Orving Road, and standing beside her, one hand resting flat on the mare's neck, was a woman. She was not young and she was not old. She was somewhere in the middle, the way the country makes people, aged by weather and decision rather than years. She wore a dark wool coat, mended twice at least at the left sleeve, and a hat that had seen better country than this. She had a flour sack tied at the top sitting in the dirt beside her boot, and she was looking at the mare with an expression that was not grief, exactly, but something quieter and more final than that. She was not crying, I noted that. I noted it because the horse was clearly dying and she clearly knew it, and she was not crying. We rode up and I asked her what had happened, and she told me in plain sentences. The mare had been failing for 2 days. She had hoped to reach Aldercross before nightfall. She had not. The mare had gone down half a mile back and she had walked her to the gate, which was as far as the animal would go. She said all of this looking at me directly, not at Dobie or Red, the way a person talks who is used to being the one in charge of a situation, even when the situation has gone badly. I asked her where she was headed and she said Aldercross. She had said that already. I said, yes, ma'am, I know. I mean after Aldercross. She looked at me for a moment and said she had kin in Brennan County, a sister, and she was making her way there from Harwick before winter closed the passes. She said it without self-pity and without apology, which I respected. I told her she was about 18 miles from Aldercross, and that the passes to Brennan County would likely close within the week, and that she was standing on the Holt Ranch, which was the only roof between here and town. She looked at the gate, then at the house in the distance, then back at me. She said, I don't need charity. I said, no, ma'am, I can see that, but you may need a roof. That was when your father rode up. Gus Holt was not a man who announced himself. He did not come down the lane at a lope or make any kind of entrance. He simply appeared, the way he always did, on that big dark roan he rode those years, and he sat the horse and looked at the scene at the gate the way he looked at most things, as if he were calculating what it was going to cost him. He was 52 years old that November. He had run the Sable Creek Basin operation since your grandfather handed it to him, and he had run it well, and when your mother, his first wife, Clara, died of fever 3 years before, he had continued running it the way a man runs a thing when the running of it is the only thing keeping him from going under. He was not mean. I want to be clear about that because some people have described him that way and they are wrong. He was not mean. He was closed. There is a difference. He looked at the woman, then at the horse, then at me. I said, her mare's gone down. She's headed to Brennan County. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the woman. She looked back at him with the same directness she had given me, except there was something else in it now, a kind of readiness, like she had already decided how this conversation was going to go, and she was waiting for him to catch up. He said, you have people in Brennan County. She said, a sister. He said passes will close. She said I'm aware. He said you have money for the stage to Aldercross. A pause, the kind that answers the question. He looked away, off toward the North Ridge, the way he did when he was thinking something through. The wind came along the creek and flattened the grass and moved on. Then he said, we need a cook. The woman who was cooking left in September to marry a man in Fort Crail. You can stay the winter in exchange for cooking and keeping the house. Your own room, meals included, wages of $8 a month. Come spring I'll see you get passage to Aldercross. She stood very still. He said it's a practical arrangement. I'm not offering charity, I'm offering work. She looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she said, $9 a month. Dobie Fitch made a sound. I looked at him and he stopped making it. Your father looked at the woman. Something moved behind his eyes. I had known him long enough to see it, though I couldn't have said what it was. He said $9. She said, and the horse? He said the horse is dying. She said, I know that. I mean when she's gone I want her buried proper, not dragged off. Another pause. He said, all right. She picked up her flour sack and came through the gate. Her name, she told me as I walked with her up the lane, was Vera Sutton. She had been widowed 4 years ago in Harwick. Her husband had been a freighter, a good man. She said it simply. And she had been working her way since then, taking what work came and moving on when it ran out. She said none of this as complaint. She said it the way a person reports the weather. Here is what happened. Here is where things stand. I showed her to the room off the kitchen, which was the warmest in the house, and which Gus had said nothing about but which I judged was the right place to put her. She set her flour sack on the floor and looked at the room, the iron bed, the small window, the peg on the wall, and she nodded once, as if confirming something she had already known. I asked if she needed anything. She said she needed to know where the pantry was. I showed her. By 6 o'clock that evening, there was a meal on the table that none of us had any right to expect given what she'd had to work with, and the house smelled like something it hadn't smelled like in 3 years, and the 4 of us, me and Dobie and Red and your father, sat down to it in a silence that had a different quality than the usual kind. Your father ate without comment. Vera Sutton ate without comment. The rest of us ate very carefully and said nothing at all. The arrangement, as your father had called it, held. It held on cool terms, which suited both parties fine. Vera cooked and kept the house, and that was what she had agreed to do, and that was what she did thoroughly and without excess, the way she seemed to do everything. She was up before the rest of us and she had coffee on before I got to the kitchen, and she kept the pantry organized in a manner that shamed the previous 2 years of our improvised management, and she did not ask for conversation, and she did not offer it unnecessarily. Your father, for his part, treated the arrangement the way he treated all business arrangements, correctly and at arm's length. He said good morning when he came through the kitchen. He said thank you after meals. He left her wages in an envelope on the 1st of each month with the same mechanical reliability that he paid the hands. And he otherwise conducted himself as if she were a piece of functional equipment that had been installed in the house and was performing to spec. I watched all of this from the outside, the way I had always watched things at the Holt Ranch, and I noticed certain details that I did not remark upon. I noticed, for instance, that in the first week of November, your father had taken to eating supper 30 minutes later than his usual time, which happened to be when Vera was finished in the kitchen, and had sat down with her own plate at the far end of the table. I noticed that in the second week, he had begun leaving the lamp on in the front room past his normal bedtime, which happened to be the room adjacent to the one she sat in after supper to do her mending. I noticed that in the third week, he had twice corrected Dobie Fitch for cursing within earshot of the house, which he had never previously cared about. I noticed these things and I kept them to myself, which is the only reasonable thing to do when you value both your employment and your continued good health. What I could not have predicted, what I don't think anyone could have predicted, was Vera Sutton. She was not soft. I want to make that clear because it matters. She was not the kind of woman who softens a man by being gentle and yielding and easy to be around. She was not easy to be around. She had opinions, and she held them plainly, and she did not adjust them for the convenience of whoever was in the room. She had a way of looking at a thing that had gone wrong and saying exactly what was wrong with it, not unkindly, but with a directness that left no comfortable place to stand if you'd been the one to let it go wrong. She was also, underneath all of that, quietly funny. Not joke-telling funny, the dry, flat kind of funny that comes out sideways in a single sentence and catches you off guard when you were not expecting to laugh. The hands figured this out faster than your father did. By the end of the first month, Dobie Fitch had decided she was the finest woman in the territory, which I thought was probably an overstatement, but not by much. Red, who, as I mentioned, rarely spoke, had taken to lingering near the kitchen door after supper on the transparent excuse of checking on the woodpile, which was always full. Your father maintained his arm's-length arrangement and seemed to think this was sustainable. He was wrong, but it took him a while to find that out. The first real crack appeared in early December over the ranch ledger. I should explain that your father kept meticulous books. He had kept them himself since before he inherited the ranch, and he had a system, a particular system, and he did not regard the system as open to improvement by outside parties. This was known and accepted throughout the operation. What was not known, or not anticipated, was that Vera Sutton had also kept books. In Harwick, for her husband's freighting business, and before that for a dry goods store where she had worked in her early years. She had, in other words, more experience with a ledger than most men in Orving County, and she had a faster head for figures than your father, which was saying something. This came out because your father made an error. It was not a large error. It was a transposition in the feed costs for October, the kind of thing that happens when a man is tired and working by lamplight, and has been running a cattle operation by himself for 3 years without adequate help. It amounted to a discrepancy of $11 across 2 columns. $11 was not going to ruin the Holt Ranch. But Vera spotted it. She spotted it because she had found the ledger on the kitchen table where your father had left it, and she had looked at it the way she looked at most things, directly and without particular invitation. And she had seen the transposition immediately, because that is the kind of mind she had. Your father came in from the barn at midday and found her at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and a pencil in her hand. The silence that followed was, in my experience of such silences, a significant one. I was in the doorway to the front room, and I stayed very still. Your father said, "That's the ranch ledger." She said, "I know what it is." He said, "I didn't ask you to look at it." She said, "No, you left it on the table and went out. October's feed costs are transposed. Column 3 should read 44, not 40. It's thrown your November carry forward by $11. A pause. He said, "I see that." She said, "Do you want me to correct it?" He said, "I'll correct it myself." She pushed the ledger toward him across the table and picked up her coffee. He sat down, looked at the ledger, picked up the pencil, and made the correction. Then he looked at the other entries, moving back through October and then through September. This took some minutes. I stood in the doorway and did not breathe very loudly. He said, without looking up, "You kept books before." She said, "In Harwick, my husband's freighting business." He said, "For how long?" She said, 6 years. He turned a page, then another. He said, "There's a method to how I organize the grazing rotation costs. It may not look right to you, but it's deliberate." She said, "I can see that. It works mostly. The way you've spread the line items for the north and south pasture gets confusing in winter when you're splitting the herd, but it works." He looked up. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without aggression, simply present. He said, "What would you do differently?" She said, "I'd split it by head count rather than by pasture. Easier to track over the winter months when the rotation changes." He said, "Show me." She pulled the ledger back across the table. They sat there for the better part of an hour. I went out to the barn and found some things to do that took me far enough away that I could not hear anything, which seemed like the right instinct. When I came back to the house at supper time, the ledger was closed on the shelf where it lived, and Vera was at the stove, and your father was at the table drinking coffee and reading something, and neither of them said anything about it. But that evening, for the first time since Vera Sutton had come through the gate at the Holt Ranch, your father did not eat and then leave the table. He stayed. He read his paper. Vera sat at the far end and did her mending. I drank my coffee and pretended to be very interested in a catalog from a seed company in Cheyenne. It was the most ordinary evening I had spent in that house in 3 years. December moved through the way December does in the Sable Creek Basin, slowly and cold, with short days that went dark by 4 in the afternoon and left you with long evenings and a lot of firelight. The arrangement had evolved in small ways that no one formally acknowledged. Vera had, at some point in November, extended her management of the kitchen to include the pantry inventory, which had been in a state of optimistic chaos since Clara's death. She had reorganized it without comment and handed your father a list of what they needed before the passes closed, and he had looked at the list and ridden to Aldercross and come back with everything on it plus a few things she hadn't listed, which I noticed and which he did not explain. Your father had, at some point in early December, begun leaving the ledger on the kitchen table rather than in the front room. This was, I believe, entirely deliberate, and I believe he believed it was not obvious. He was wrong on the second count, but right on the first. Vera, for her part, had started leaving a plate covered on the back of the stove on the nights he came in late from checking the herd in the north pasture. She did this without ceremony. It was simply there when he came in, covered with a cloth, warm from the residual heat of the dying fire. He ate it without ceremony. No one mentioned it. The Hands had noticed all of this. Dobie Fitch had, at some point, conceived the theory that the whole business would be resolved by Christmas. Red had apparently bet against this and set a figure of February. I declined to participate in the wager on the grounds that I had some dignity, and also because I thought Red was probably closer to right, and I did not want to be seen taking the pessimistic position. What none of us had anticipated was the books. Not the ledger, the other books. Your father had a shelf of them in the front room, which he had accumulated over 20-some years, and which he read with the same disciplined regularity he brought to everything else. History, mostly. Some geography. A few novels that he would not have admitted to if asked. Vera, it turned out, was also a reader. This came out on a Wednesday evening in mid-December when your father returned from the front room to find that the book he had been working through, A History of the Cattle Routes Through the Territories, which he had set down on the kitchen table before supper and forgotten there, was in Vera Sutton's hands. She had read 20 pages. He said, "That's my book." She said, "I can see that. It's good. The chapter on the Kishom Trail is better than I expected." He said, "You've read History of the Cattle Routes before." She said, "My husband was a freighter. I read what was around. Do you want it back?" He said, "Finish the chapter." He sat down across the table. She finished the chapter. Then she said something about what she'd read, a specific observation about the economics of the trail towns, and he said something back, and she said something else, and it was another hour before either of them appeared to realize that they had been talking, in the way that two people talk who are genuinely interested in the same thing, for more time than either of them had apparently budgeted for that kind of activity. I was in the corner with my seed catalog, and I turned pages at intervals to demonstrate that I was occupied. When Vera went to bed, she set the book on the table with the page marked. Your father picked it up, looked at the marker, and set it back down where she had left it. He did not take it to the front room. I went to bed shortly after, and I lay there for a while thinking about what Red was going to say when he won the bet, and about how the basin looked when the snow came in the way it was about to, and about August Holt sitting at a kitchen table leaving a book he'd been reading for a woman to finish, and about how the world turns on things so small you could miss them entirely if you were not paying attention. The snow came in the second week of January. Not the polite kind that sits on the fence rails and makes the ranch look like a picture in a catalog. The real kind, the kind that comes out of the northwest with a wind behind it and does not stop for 3 days, and when it stops the world is a different shape than it was before. We lost 14 head in the north pasture. We could not get to them in time. The drifts came up against the fence line faster than anyone had counted on, and by the time we were able to get out there, the damage was done. Your father said nothing when we brought him the count. He stood in the barn door looking north and said nothing for about a minute, and then he said to rotate the remaining herd to the south pasture and check the line at the creek, and he went inside. I found him later at the kitchen table with the ledger. Vera set a cup of coffee in front of him and went back to the stove. She did not say anything about the cattle. She did not ask him how he was managing. She simply put the coffee there and went back to what she was doing. After a while he said, without looking up, 14 head. About $600 at current prices. She said, I know. He said, that's a hard January. She said, it is. He said, the south pasture line is good. We won't lose more if the weather holds through the week. She said, the weather will hold through the week. He looked up. She said, I watch it come in. The pressure changed on Tuesday. It moved through fast. It's done. He looked at her. She said, I grew up in ranch country before Harwick. My father ran cattle in the Myrna Basin. I know how the weather moves in the basin after a 3-day blow. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the Myrna Basin, that's hard country. She said, it is. It made my father hard. It made me practical. There's a difference there, too, though he never saw it. She said it without bitterness, matter of fact, and turned back to the stove. Your father looked at her back for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to the ledger. The weather held through the week, as she said it would. February arrived, and the bet, to Red's quiet satisfaction, remained unresolved. The arrangement had, by this point, drifted considerably from its original terms, without anyone having renegotiated anything. Vera had begun, at some point in January, sitting at the table with the ledger alongside your father on the evenings when he worked the books, not because he had asked her to, but because her head count method of organizing the grazing costs had required a transition in the records, and she was familiar with the transition in a way that he was not yet. They had developed over those evenings a kind of working shorthand. She would note something, he would question it or confirm it, they would move on. It was efficient, and it was businesslike, and it was also, I will say plainly, something I had not seen at that table in 3 years. The evenings had also extended. Not dramatically, Vera was not given to staying up late, and neither was your father, but where November evenings had ended at 8 o'clock with everyone going their separate ways, February evenings sometimes ran to 9:30 or 10, with the ledger closed and the conversation moving somewhere else. The cattle market, the spring planting, the history of the territory, whatever was at hand. Vera had her opinions on all of it. Your father had his. They disagreed regularly and without drama, and then moved on, which was, I think, something your father had not had access to in a long time. What no one had said, and what I was increasingly certain everyone in the house was aware of, was the simple fact that Vera Sutton could leave in the spring. That had always been the arrangement. Come spring, your father had said at the gate in November, he would see her get passage to Aldercross. The passes to Brennan County would open. Her sister was waiting. March was not far off. I did not know what Vera intended. She had not said. She had not, as far as I had seen, written to her sister in Brennan County since she had been at the ranch. I had been to Aldercross twice in February, and she had not given me letters to post. But absence of letters was not a statement of intention, and I was not going to draw conclusions that were not mine to draw. I did not know, either, what your father intended, because your father was the kind of man who could intend a thing for a considerable period of time before he arrived at any intention to act on it, and the whole history of the arrangement had been conducted in a language of practical necessity that left a great deal unsaid. I thought about talking to him. I decided against it on the grounds that if I had talked to Gus Holt about his feelings for the woman in his kitchen, he would have looked at me in a way that I would have found uncomfortable, and also because it was none of my business, and also because I believed, and I believe now, that some things have to find their own way to the surface without anyone digging for them. What I had not counted on was the second storm. It came on the second Thursday of February, smaller than the January blow but meaner, with a different quality to it, the kind of cold that gets into the house through the window frames and sits there. By mid-morning the temperature had dropped hard and the wind was driving snow sideways across the yard, and by noon it was clear no one was going anywhere until it broke. We were all inside, your father, me, Dobie, Red, and Vera. The hands had their bunkhouse and they retired to it after the morning chores. Your father and I sat in the kitchen. Vera was baking. The afternoon went the way afternoons go when there is nowhere to go and nothing pressing that can be done slowly, with a lot of coffee and not much talking. At some point in the mid-afternoon, your father got up and went to the front room and came back with 2 books and set one of them on the end of the table nearest to where Vera was working, without comment, and sat down with the other one. I had been with him long enough to know what he had done, and I occupied myself with great thoroughness. Vera looked at the book, then at him, then picked it up. They read for about an hour. Then Vera said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Your wife, Clara, you have a daughter with her." He said, "In Cheyenne, with her grandmother." She said, "How old?" He said, 14. She said, "Do you see her?" He said, "In summers. She comes for the summer months." A pause. Vera said, "She should know this ranch." Your father said, "She does know it." Vera said, "I mean she should know it the way you know it, not as a summer place." He looked up from his book. She said, "She's 14. In a few years she'll be grown and making her own decisions. If she doesn't know this land and this work by then, she won't know how to value it. And she'll make decisions about it the way someone makes decisions about a thing they don't fully understand." He was quiet. She said, "That's not a criticism. I don't know your arrangements with her grandmother. I'm just saying what I see." He said, "What do you see?" She said, "A man who runs a good ranch and keeps good books and does everything right, and has a daughter in a city who doesn't know what her father built." He looked at his book without reading it. After a while he said, "Her grandmother is a capable woman, Margaret. She wanted the girl near her after Clara died. I thought it was right to let her stay." Vera said, "That was generous of you." He said, "I don't know if it was generous. I think I told myself it was generous. I think I also thought it was easier." He said it simply, without self-pity, and without apparently having planned to say it. Vera looked at him. He said, "She's a good girl. She writes to me every month." Vera said, "I know. I've seen the letters on the desk." He said, "I write back." She said, "I know that too." A pause. The wind moved around the corner of the house. He said, "I'll bring her for the whole summer this year, and the next, and after that if she wants to stay, she can stay." Vera said, "Good." She went back to her book. Your father looked at the window for a moment, then at the table, then at his book, and I believe that what he was feeling right then was something he had not felt in a long time, which was the specific and uncomplicated comfort of being in a room with a person who tells you the truth. The storm broke the next morning. The following week was one of the longest of my life, which is a strange thing to say about a week in which nothing happened, or nothing that I could have written down in the ranch log. Your father worked, Vera cooked and kept the house, I did what I was asked to do, the hands did what they were asked to do, February ran out, March arrived. I could tell you it built towards something, that there was a particular moment when everything changed and the trajectory was clear. But it was not quite like that. It was more like watching a river at the end of winter, when the ice that has been solid all season begins to give, not at a single point but all at once, in the way that ice gives when the temperature underneath has been changing for months, and the surface is the last thing to know it. The surface finally gave on the 12th of March. I know the date because I made note of it in the back of my personal log, which is the kind of thing you do when you are 67 years old, and you have watched a man you have known for 41 years do something you did not think you would ever see him do. It was an evening after supper. I had stayed at the table longer than usual. Your father had the ledger. Vera had her mending. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room had gone warm and quiet the way it does in March when the cold is starting to let go of things. Your father closed the ledger. He sat for a moment with his hand flat on the cover. Then he said, "The passes are open." Vera did not look up from her mending. She said, "I know." He said, "You could get to Aldercross by the end of the week. The stage runs again from Tuesday." She said, "I know." He said, "Your sister is in Brennan County." She said, "I know where my sister is." A pause. He said, "I'd like you to stay." The mending stopped. He said, "I'm not asking you to stay for the cooking. I'm asking you to stay because this ranch needs someone who can keep the books right, and who knows how the weather moves in a basin, and who doesn't manage me and doesn't require managing. And because this is the first winter in 3 years that this house has felt like something other than a place where I wait out the dark." He said it all at once. In the flat, careful way he said things that mattered to him, looking at the ledger rather than at her. Then he looked at her. She looked back at him. She said, "If I stay as a partner in this operation, not as a cook. I'll keep the books and manage the household accounts, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong about something, and I'll expect you to tell me the same." He said, "That's what I want." She said, "I have a sister in Brennan County who I haven't seen in 2 years." He said, "We'll go in the summer before the girl comes. You can see her properly." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a reasonable answer." He said, "I have one more thing to say." She said, "All right." He said, "I'd like to ask you to marry me, in a proper way with a proper ceremony when you're ready for it, not as an arrangement, as the real thing. I understand if you need time to think about it. I understand if the answer is no, but I would rather say it plain than leave it unsaid." He said that last part looking at her with the same directness she had always used on everyone else, and I do not think he had any idea how much it suited him. I was sitting in the corner with my coffee, and I was very still, and I was thinking that Red was going to be insufferable about the timing, and also that I was going to remember this for the rest of my life, which is now a long time ago and which I have, in fact, remembered. Vera Sutton set her mending on the table. She said, "August Holt, you are the least sentimental man I have met in my entire life, and I have met some who gave you competition." He said, "I know it." She said, "You left a book on the table for me to find in December because you wanted to know if I could carry on a conversation about it, and you could not bring yourself to simply ask." He said, "That is probably accurate." She said, "You have corrected the ranch hands for language 3 times in my hearing, when you clearly did not previously care about their language? He said, I wouldn't say I didn't care. She said, you moved the ledger to the kitchen, so I would look at it. A pause. He said, the kitchen table has better light. She said, Gus. He said, yes. She said, I haven't written to my sister since November because I didn't know how to tell her. I wasn't sure I was coming. He was still. She said, I'll need to write to her now. He said, all right. She said, the answer is yes. He nodded once, the way he confirmed things that mattered carefully and without excess. I got up and took my coffee out to the front room, which seemed like the appropriate thing to do, and I sat there for a while listening to the fire settle and the wind moving around the eaves and two people at a kitchen table in Irving County deciding on the rest of their lives. And I thought that this was about as good as ranching got and about as good as people got, and that I was lucky to have been in the room for it. They married in the parlor on the 28th of March. I stood as a witness, which was an honor I felt in a way I did not know how to say and did not try to. Dobie, Fitch, and Red were there, and a neighbor from the Crancho place 6 miles east who had known your father since before Clara, and that was all. Vera had sent a letter to her sister in Brennan County, and received a letter back that made her read it twice by the window before she set it on the shelf, and I did not ask about the contents of it. The ceremony was short because your father had asked for it to be short, and Vera had agreed that short was better than long for a thing that was going to last a long time. They said what needed saying. Vera wrote to her sister again the following week, a longer letter, and she went to Brennan County in June before your half-sister arrived for the summer, and when she came back to the Holt Ranch the way a person comes back to a place that is theirs. Your half-sister arrived in July, 14 years old, with your father's eyes and her mother's way of moving, and I watched Vera handle that situation the way she handled everything, directly, without pretense, and with a patience that was not soft but was very steady. By the end of the first week they were working the kitchen together. By the end of the summer the girl was asking to come back for the school term as well, which your father agreed to before she had finished the sentence. The ledger, after the transition to the head count method, ran clean for years. Vera was right about the weather most of the time. She was also right about your father and your half-sister, who knows this ranch the way you know it, because of what your mother built here in those months between November and March, and because of what she gave to a man who had run out of the capacity for the kind of warmth that keeps a place alive and got it back in the hardest and best way there is. I have been at the Holt Ranch for 41 years, and I have seen a great many things in that time, and most of them I would not call remarkable. But a woman came through that gate in November with a dying horse and a flour sack and $9 a month and no intention of asking for charity, and she sat down at that kitchen table and told the truth to a man who needed to hear it, and by spring, this house was a home again. That is what I know, that is what I saw. And I would tell it the same way every time.